The stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the Man from Lang. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, we are kicking off our review of the player cards in the revised core set with part 1 of our look at the Guardian cards. There are spoilers throughout if you care about that sort of thing. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. A quick reminder of how we rate cards here on The Whisper in Darkness. The best of the best get an Elder Sign, while the worst of the worst receive an Auto Fail, and the cards in between get a +1, 0, or Elder Thing respectively. New for this batch of reviews, cards that are good in one particular investigator or cards that you build around will receive a Bless token. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the patrons of this channel for their tremendous support. The Arkham Horror LCG community is amazing, and these people have gone above and beyond to bring you content like these reviews. If you'd like to support the channel's goals and see your name on this list, head over to patreon.com, sign up for a tier of your choice, and claim your rewards. That would be awesome. Without further ado, let's get started. We are back with our review of the core set cards. I am joined, of course, by Nate, Lost in Time and Space.
Hello, everybody. How are you?
And our new member of the team, Matastrophic.
Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be here.
So we are going to review all of the cards in the revised core set, starting with the Guardian cards. We're going to be reviewing these cards within the context of the revised core, and we'll also talk a little bit about how they fit within the larger card pool once you have tired of the scenarios in the revised core set and you want to dip your toe into Arkham Horror at large. There's I think 7 cycles at this point, so there is a lot of cards out there and a lot of scenarios to play, so we will touch on that a little bit. We have divided the reviews into 3 parts. We will take a look at part 1. We'll take a look at the first 5 cards in the Guardian card pool. Part 2 will take a look at the second 5 cards, and finally the third part will look at the upgrades. So we'll do that for each of the classes in the game. So you will have plenty of videos to make your way through here once we finish this. And then I just received word yesterday that my copies of Edge of the Earth Investigator expansion are on the way. So we will dig into reviewing all of those player cards. That's the first time we'll be doing that, the new change in format. So we have a ton of cards to review in that, and we'll tackle that after the revised core set. The first Guardian card in the box is the 45 Automatic. It is a 4-cost asset with the item, weapon, and firearm traits. It enters play with 4 ammo. As an action, you can spend 1 ammo, fight. You get +1 combat for this attack. This attack deals +1 damage, and it takes up a hand slot. +1 combat and +1 damage is the baseline of a good weapon in this game. If it does not have that, it better have something else to prop it up, because dealing that extra damage is so important in terms of just making sure you can keep your tempo up.
Yeah, the 45 Automatic is a really solid weapon, especially within the context of just the core set, given that your options are essentially this, the Machete, and the knife. I believe that's it.
Within Guardian, that is.
Yeah, within the Guardian card pool specifically. The 45 really does kind of stand out amongst the other ones. You always get that damage bonus, which is nice, and you always get that combat bonus, so you're not reliant on only being engaged with one enemy with something like the Machete. It only takes up 1 hand slot, which is really nice too, especially if you're playing either solo or in 2-player. You often need to do double duty, so being able to hold a flashlight in your other hand really helps out a lot.
Yeah, the 45 Automatic it's I consider it kind of like the baseline weapon for level 0. You know, 4 cost, 4 shots, but the key is it gives you a combat bonus, and it deals 2 damage. That's the important thing. To be honest, if a weapon doesn't deal do at least 2 damage, even at level 0, like, it's probably not making it into the deck, because it's all about the saving actions on defeating enemies with multiple health points.
The only tricky thing with the 45 Automatic is enemies with odd health totals. You know, you really don't want to use your ammo to shoot, to shoot 3 health enemies twice. You ideally want to shoot them once and then fight the second time, and that can be difficult sometimes.
Yeah,
that's
that's
kind
where
of one of the
that's where having a second weapon in your offhand can really help out. If you're worried about the combat bonus, that's a good time to have even a spare knife handy, just to be able to knife the thing and be done with it.
yeah, or loading up with um combat icons in your hand to just be able to punch an enemy without spending any ammo. That's nice too. But then again, it's it's my understanding that 3 health enemies are kind of one of the challenges of Arkham Horror. Like how is my deck built to be able to handle a 3 health enemy? Do I really spend 2 of my precious 4 ammo dealing with a 3 health enemy, or do I spend 1 ammo to deal 2 damage and then some other effect to deal an additional damage? And there's actually quite a few effects to deal additional damage. Yeah, beyond the 2 from a single 45 shot, and I think we'll go into some of those in a little while here.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that many of the enemies in the revised core set usually have 2 or 4 health. Three health is not that common, but it has become a lot more common as the card pool has expanded. In fact, where a lot of enemies would have 2 health, many of them now have 3. So it is a little more difficult to deal with those enemies. I think it's worth noting here that the 45 automatic does have a level 2 upgrade in the Phantom of Truth Mythos pack. So if you like what the 45 automatic does, you can pick up an upgrade for it. It helps you against enemies with Retaliate. It does have an agility skill icon, although I'm not too sure how often that is going to be used. It's nice to have one for Roland, just in case he does need to pass that agility skill test. But I think it's rare that you're going to discard this to it, because if you are largely responsible for enemy management, if you're playing it, especially in multiplayer, those 4 ammo aren't going to go as far as you would hope. And so often you will want to not commit this to a skill test, but you will want to be playing the second copy down until you can upgrade to extra ammunition once you've gained some experience points. Now, it is important to note here that the 45 automatic and the Machete are your bread and butter weapons in the core set, and so the biggest difference is that the Machete is a hair cheaper, provides the same combat and damage bonuses, and doesn't run out of ammo, which is a huge boon if you are doing a lot of the fighting. It does have a drawback, but that drawback is often negligible a lot of the time. How would you guys rate this card?
Within the context of the core set, I think this is Elder Sign. It's a very solid weapon in Guardian, and oftentimes, like you said, you're going to need all the weapons you can get. I know, Matistoff, you had mentioned in our initial review of Roland that you generally want to have about 5 or so weapons in your deck, and this is a really solid weapon to have in your deck. And like Man from Lang, you said, if you like this card, there's also an upgrade for it once you get into the Carcosa campaign, which also really, I think, gives this card a lot of stock.
Yeah, within the context of the core, I'd agree with the Elder Sign rating, because it's kind of essential. Are you playing a fighter? Take 45 automatic. Enough said. Outside of the core set, Guardian starts getting a lot of options at level 0. So I think 45 automatic starts feeling a little costly as time goes on. But I think within the context of the core set, yeah, it's essential. You take it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm not prepared to go quite as high as an Elder Sign for the 45 automatic, simply because the Machete does exist. So I'm going to settle at +1. But I think the 45 automatic does hold its value fairly well compared to the Machete. I think the Machete suffers a little bit more than the 45 automatic as the card pool grows. But yeah, I mean, if you're playing either a combat oriented Roland or a combat oriented Skids, I mean, 2 copies of the 45 automatic are pretty much a requirement. You can't really get away without it. The second card in the box is Physical Training. It's a 2-cost asset with the a willpower and combat skill icon. It's a talent. As a free triggered ability, you may spend 1 resource. You get +1 willpower for this skill test. As a free triggered ability, you may spend 1 resource to get +1 combat for this skill test. Thoughts on our first talent? Each of the classes receives 1 talent, and they provide various skill bonuses in exchange for resources.
I think physical training is pretty solid. I think, unfortunately, however, Roland often doesn't have the resources to really utilize physical training as much as you'd probably like or feel like you should be able to. And Skids, I think, would rather spend his resources getting additional actions versus pumping them into skill tests a lot of the time. So I think, unfortunately, within the context of the core set alone, you might not get a lot of use out of this card, but once you expand your card pool, I think physical training actually gets a lot better.
Yeah, I guess when you have more options for generating resources, you can kind of come up with a strategy to really, funnel all of your willpower tests, for example, into physical training. I think of the talents, I think this one is one of the probably one of the least bad, because it helps with willpower tests. Roland has a 3 willpower, so it's nice to be able to bump that willpower to 4 or 5 to deal with that, the Roland killer rotting remains. And then Skids, within the core set, if you're at a point where you're, really pumping up money and you've got hot streaks in your deck, it's nice to be able to save a few resources to be able to boost yourself up to 5 on like a Frozen in Fear. This card might save your life against Frozen in Fear as Skids. So I think in that regard, that's why I feel like this one is not bad. I think there is a larger discussion to be had about the play style of relying on talents, spending money to fuel stat bonuses, because there's a lot of implications there about how you build the rest of your deck and how you play. Because when you're in a situation where every single resource can go towards boosting skill tests, that's going to affect your other card choices. It's going to make you want to do really cheap things, and it's going to make you want to play a lot of skills. Because you're not going to be able to afford to play lots of assets and still lean on physical training.
Yeah, I agree with you that this is one of those cards that like Roland doesn't really have the cash for this, at least at the beginning of a scenario, because he is trying to get down his B cops and his 45 automatics, and that's where most of his money is going at the beginning. I do think this does have a place in the deck toward the end of a scenario, where investigators generally tend to start to pool resources as the scenario goes on, and they have less things to spend them on. So you can often find yourself sitting on a nice little pot of resources toward the end, and you can if you can dump them to this, sometimes that can really save your life, whether you're playing Skids and you need to pass one of those willpower skill tests just in order to keep going in the game, or if you're Roland and you've got your gun on the table and you draw, say, a Crypt Chill, and you really need to keep that gun on the table. Dumping a bunch of resources to this is often your last resort, and if you can pass that skill test, and you don't happen to have another gun in your hand, you've probably saved yourself quite a bit of work later in the scenario. But yeah, I know when I initially started building decks, I'd throw 2 copies of talents in, and I gradually trimmed that back to 1, and in many decks I cut them back to 0, because the investigators simply don't have the ability to really pay for them. You do have to pay 2 resources up front for this, for a card that basically just sits there until you have to pay more for it. So it's not ideal, but it can save your life. And that's often worth the 2 resources in an action sometimes, because you never know when you're going to need it, but it's awfully nice to have it on the table when it is called for. It's worth noting that there is a level 2 upgrade for physical training in the Knight of the Zealot product, and a level 4 upgrade that comes with 2 resources that replenish themselves in the Nathaniel Cho starter deck. So a very nice upgrade that fuels itself, so it provides the resources you may not have yourself. How would you rate this card?
I think within the context of the core set, I'd probably give it a 0. Like you said, it's a decent late game card, but in the early game, I think you're going to struggle to find much use for it.
I actually think it's a 0 as well, largely because of what the reasons you said there, Mr. Lang, that near the end of the game, when you've got a lot of resources pooled, that's also the time when you're going to want to boost your willpower most. So that way you can avoid being totally taken out by a rotting remains. So physical training is nice to have as the game goes on. Oh, and to deal with the ghoul priest, because that ghoul priest has got retaliate. So you want to really bump your tests against the ghoul priest, don't you?
Yeah, I think a lot of the talents in this box for me end up being zeros because I wouldn't want to play 2 copies of them, but I'd be quite happy to put one in my deck. And then as the game progresses, I know I'm not going to play it toward the beginning of a scenario, but toward the end, if I know, you're fighting something like the Ghoul Priest at the end of the gathering, it's nice to have that option of saying, okay, I'm going to put this down. I'm going to be able to pump a couple combat skill tests or protect myself from the rotting remains that could potentially kill me, and use these resources that have pooled up, because the resources are only as good as what you spend them on. And I know in some decks I've built that I have gotten to the end of scenarios and I've had 10 or 12 resources, and I'm like, well, man, I should really put a talent in this deck for situations just like this. But yeah, I think in many cases, 1 copy in a deck is plenty. Our third card in the box is Beat Cop, our first ally. It is a 4-cost asset with a combat skill icon, ally, and police traits. You get +1 combat, and as a free triggered ability, you may discard the Beat Cop, deal 1 damage to an enemy at your location. It has 2 health, 2 sanity, and it takes up an ally slot. I think we can all agree that most, if not all, allies in the game that provide passive skill boosts tend to be very, very good.
Yes, that is a bit of an understatement, especially with the core set allies. All of them seem to be really good. Beat Cop especially feels like one of the standouts. The Beat Cop has really stood the test of time, I think. Is very solid even when you expand your card pool. And within the context of just the core set, he is a great ally to have in a Roland deck and even a Skids deck. Being able to boost your combat up to a 4 or a 5 is really quite good to deal with annoying enemies. And if you happen to fail a test trying to fight that enemy and he's already soaked up a sanity point, you can just chuck him and get that last point of damage off and get that enemy off of you before it kills you.
Yeah, especially in Roland, Beat Cop is pretty essential, especially in a multiplayer setting. You're going to be making a lot of combat checks. So anything that's going to permanently boost your combat is going to be really, really good, pretty essential. I think as the card pool expands, that Beat Cop's 4 resource cost starts to feel a bit pricey. Although in the context of Roland, he's still really good because, honestly, because of that 2 sanity. Just having the Beat Cop out there, it turns Roland from having 5 sanity to virtually 7. And that alone, that means you can survive more rotting remains, to be honest. Like, having 2 sanity is nice. Yeah.
Yeah, it's I think it's important to note here that besides the soak of the 2 health and especially the 2 sanity, that ability to deal testless damage is very, very powerful, especially if you're interested in dipping your toe into higher levels of difficulty where there's a lot more variance in the chaos bag. And the ability to ping something for 1 without having to reach your hand into the bag can make a huge difference. There is the level 2 upgrade for Beat Cop within the revised core set, and often I think upgrading your Beat Cop is one of the first things you should be doing, just because the revised Beat or the upgraded Beat Cop is just so strong. The biggest weakness of the level 0 version, of course, being the fact that you need to discard the Beat Cop in order to deal that damage. And I think many players will be very reluctant once they see just how powerful Beat Cop can be on all of those combat skill tests, that discarding it is, you'll do that very, very reticently. Whereas the upgraded version of the Beat Cop, you only have to deal a damage to it, so it can stick around for quite a long time if you're mete out that damage a bit at a time. How would you rate this card?
I think I would give this. I'm so tempted to give it an Elder Sign, but like Matastrophic said, it is expensive. So I'll give it a +1. It is so good. And like you said, the level 2 version is arguably one of the best cards within this Guardian card pool.
Yeah. Once again, we're unified. I'd also give it a +1 because it's pretty essential if you're playing a primary Monster Slayer like Roland. Skids, I'm not so sure about Skids in Beat Cop because as we discussed in the Skids review, Skids is you often want to play him as more of a guy who gets things done when he needs to, and that Beat Cop, it's pretty costly. That's costing Skids effectively 2 actions. That being said, he kind of makes up for an action by providing that single damage, but it's still kind of expensive. Either way, Beat Cop, I think a +1 in the context of the core is pretty spot on.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with +1 as well. For me, it's not so much the cost. After playing lots of Guardian Investigators, spending a lot for assets, as you sort of get used to it. For me, the big thing with this Beat Cop is just the fact that you've got to discard it to use that ability, and that is something that you will, I think a lot of players, you're not going to do that all that often. So you're really not getting that second benefit as much as say, the upgraded version, which you can simply deal damage to. It's nice if you're at the end of a scenario and you need to just polish off that Ghoul Priest, having that Beat Cop there who you can just discard it and finish it off is very, very nice. Man, I hate that feeling of having to make that choice of whether to discard the Beat Cop or keep him around for that +1 combat skill value, because that +1 does so much work over the course of a scenario. The next card in the box is First Aid. It is a 2-cost asset with a willpower skill icon, talent, and science trait. Uses 3 supplies. If First Aid has no supplies, discard it. Spend 1 supply. Heal 1 damage or horror from an investigator at your location. It does not take up any slots. I will start with this off by saying I do not like this card. At all, really.
You've been quite vocal about your opinions on healing cards in the past, so I'm definitely not surprised. Yeah, within the context of the core set, I get why it's in here. Yeah. You know, there are times where you may have a spare action or two in multiplayer, and Roland's taken a hit from a Rotting Remains, so this can kind of buffer that a little bit, but it's really slow. Like it costs you 2 resources in an action to get it down, and then you spend another action to heal 1 horror.
It's just slow. In fact, I think the designers actually realized how slow it was, because a lot of healing effects since the core set have healed for more than just 1 per action. In fact, the level 3 First Aid, I think that one's like pretty decent because it heals for 1 of each. So it's like you get double the healing, and I think that one's like serviceable. Having to play an asset as an action, and then getting your first point of healing as an additional action, oh, that's so slow. Just play an ally or something instead.
Or even just commit this card to that Rotting Remains in the first place, so you don't take that 1 extra point of horror.
Yeah, that's actually another thing to think about is like. And it's a good way, it's actually a decent way, at least in the core set when you're building your initial decks of judging cards, is like, would I rather just play Guts?
When you initially start playing the Arkham Horror LCG, the idea of healing sounds really appealing. It's like, I'm going to take damage, I need a way to heal it. But I think what players quickly realized as the game progressed, that soaking damage with allies or mitigating the damage with cards like Dodge, which allows you to prevents an attack against you, so you're not taking any damage or horror, or I've had Worse 4 from which is included in the revised core set, that allows you to basically just cancel damage and horror and then gain resources instead, is just so much more efficient than taking the action to play this, taking the action to heal. It's just like you say, it is just so slow. And this is a problem with many of the healing cards. that have been put out. Many of them do this, and the designers have slowly sort of moved away from that. So you're not taking so much time. I think it's worth noting that if you look at the tips they give you on playing Roland in the revised core set rule book, one of the tips is don't be afraid of hitting up first aid 3 times in one turn just to heal all the horror you might have taken. I'm going to say don't do that. That is terrible. Don't do that. Just play an ally who can soak the damage and horror for you, and you'll be so much better off. The Arkham Horror LCG at its heart is a race, and taking all that time to not only play first aid, but then hit it up 3 times on one turn, basically just missing your turn to heal a bunch of horror, is really just not worth it. How
and
would you?
You draw Rotting Remains, and then you take all that horror back.
Yeah, exactly. So how would you rate this one?
Tentacle, don't play it. It's bad. Play Guts or play more allies. Don't play this.
This is the first time I'm gonna have to slightly disagree. It is bad, so don't get me wrong here. It's not a good card within the core set, but I'm gonna give this an Elder thing because I do think it gains a little more stock once you have Carolyn Fern specifically, who can sort of counteract that loss in actions, because she can heal horror and then get a resource to that person, which can be beneficial, but that is very fringe. And the other thing to note about this card is that it's reactive. You have to wait until you take damage and horror. So it already has to be in play when you take the damage and horror for it to be useful. Because there are going to be times when you need to heal damage and horror, but there's an enemy on you, and you're not going to be able to play this thing. So
right.
Yeah, I initially, man, I really don't like this card, but I don't think I'm going to go as low as a tentacle on this one. I think I'm going to give it an Elder thing. Simply because if you do have the time, you can heal a damage and horror from pretty much anybody at your location if necessary. So if you're playing in multiplayer, and this is probably talking specifically about multiplayer, because if you're playing solo, I really don't think you've got the time to worry about this card.
You don't have time. Yeah.
But if you are playing in multiplayer, which a lot of people do play, they're not all solo fanatics like me, you can usually find the time to play this, and say Daisy gets tagged by something, she's low on health, and you're just need a little bit to boost her up, then I think this is, it's not the worst card in the world to play, but still it would be one of those cards, if I drew it, I'd probably be unhappy to see it in my hand. And then I would probably wait until the situation was very dire, or I had a turn where I'm like, well, sometimes when you are playing a Guardian in multiplayer, if nobody draws any enemies, you can often just sort of end up sitting around doing nothing for a couple of turns while you wait for the encounter deck to spit a couple enemies out at you. So in that sort of situation, yeah, it doesn't take up a slot, and if you've got the resources to spare, it's not the worst thing in the world you could do just to provide a little added insurance just in case somebody in the group gets hurt. The final card we're going to look at in part 1 of our Guardian review is the Machete. It is a 3-cost asset with a combat skill icon, item, weapon, and melee traits. As an action, you may fight. You get +1 combat for this attack. If the attacked enemy is the only enemy engaged with you, this attack deals +1 damage, and it takes up a hand slot. Again, this one is slightly better than the 45 automatic simply because this has no ammo limit. So if you can get Machete in your opening hand, you'll be very happy indeed, because you've got that weapon it's never gonna run out.
Yeah, Machete's a really solid weapon, especially in solo, where you're only drawing 1 encounter card a turn. You're oftentimes just going to whack the enemy, they're gonna die, and then you might draw another one, and then same deal, you just 2 to 3 swings, it's dead, and you just move on. Machete essentially just becomes an unlimited 45 automatic, in circumstances like that, which is excellent. In multiplayer, there are times where sometimes you'll try to be killing an enemy for an ally of yours, and then you draw another one off the encounter deck, and then all of a sudden your weapon is not doing what you want it to do, and it really slows your game down. But those circumstances don't pop up as much as you think they would in the core set.
Yeah, that's the thing about the machete is it deals an extra damage if you're targeting the only enemy engaged with you. So what this means is that if you're attacking an enemy that's engaged with one of your friends, it will not do an additional damage, which means you have to spend an additional action to engage the thing, then you can attack it for 2 damage. And it's for that reason why personally I think I like the 45 automatic like more than the machete, because machete is a bit, except for solo. You're totally right, Mr. Lang. Except solo, machete is like the premier weapon here. But I think there's some nuances, especially in multiplayer play, where machete doesn't quite cut it, and you got to put in little extra effort to overcome the restriction. Also, the thing about machete is that when the chips are down and things are getting really bad, the machete doesn't really save you. When you're surrounded by enemies, that's when you start suffering investigator defeats, and machete doesn't help you get out of really bad situations. Whereas the 45 automatic keeps on trucking. So I feel like machete is like your sidearm compared to your 45 automatic.
That's a really good point that you make, that machete is a card that helps you snowball. It doesn't help you from behind. That's a really interesting point. And also it is worth noting that, like you said, it only deals that extra damage with enemies engaged with you, which comes up more often than you think in multiplayer.
Yeah, I have been in that position where I have been armed with my machete, and I have either ended up with 2 enemies engaged with me, or 2 enemies in play, one engaged with me and one engaged with my partner, and you're a sad panda when that happens. The machete just doesn't quite pull its weight. You end up with a weapon that does +1 combat skill bonus, and you lose that damage. In solo, the machete is generally amazing because the unless you get very unlucky, the encounter deck generally will just spit out 1 enemy at a time, and you can just whack away at them as they come and just carry on your merry way. It's very efficient for what it does. There are, I think, circumstances in a lot of the scenarios actually in the core set where you can end up, say, in Midnight Masks. If you engage a cultist and then draw an enemy, that could be bad times for you. There are plenty of enemies in final scenario. How does it work with massive? Do you get the damage against massive enemies?
You do. If it's the only enemy at the location and the enemy is massive, that is the only enemy engaged with you.
Yeah, so how would you rate this one?
Within the context of the core set, I would give this a +1. This is a very solid off weapon in multiplayer, and in solo, this is your bread and butter.
Yeah, I'm also we're back to agreeing entirely, Nate. I'm also a +1 on this one. I feel like it's solid. It does what it does. It gets the work done, but especially multiplayer, it's not your primary weapon. It's very good for those situations where you run into odd health enemies. So you've got your 45 automatic to deal 2 damage, and then you've got your machete to kind of cap things off. It's your rat slayer, so to speak, in that circumstance. And then if you have a situation where you are engaged with a single enemy, then machete gets good, and then you can just carry on with it. I think the combination of 45 automatic and machete is what you want as like a guardian.
I think I was all ready to give this thing an elder sign, but I think Matastrophic and Nate talked me down here to a +1, largely just because of its, as a primarily solo player, I've had a lot of love for the machete over the years, but I felt pretty bad when you end up with those 2 enemies, and machete almost feels like a liability at that point, rather than the tool you want in your hand. You'll be longing to have that 45 automatic at your disposal, or just about any other weapon in the game besides the machete at that point, because while it is extremely efficient when you're taking out single enemies, as soon as you get that double enemy, that efficiency just evaporates, and suddenly you're pinging them for 1 damage with +1 combat. And if you get swarmed, you're going to be a dead investigator long before the Machete can hack your way out of that the dog pile on top of you.
That being said, I think Machete does shine as a primary weapon in Skids, because Skids has 4 athletics. So he's able to, if he's surrounded by 2 enemies, he can evade one of them and then use the Machete, at full strength against the other one. So that downside of the Machete is, at least in like a solo or maybe 2-player setting, I think Skids is, it can be his primary weapon because of his evasion.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's going to do it for our part 1 of our look at the Guardian cards in the revised core set. Any final thoughts?
They get a good mix of cards here. They get solid weapons, they get a solid ally. The talent's pretty solid. First aid is passable. It has a willpower icon on it.
It's not guts, though.
It's not guts. That's true.
Yeah, I think the main thing we covered is like the primary assets. We covered the 45, the beat cop, and the Machete. Those are like, the important assets, of the Guardian here.
Yeah, the Holy Trinity.
That's going to do it for this episode. If you enjoyed what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. If you need to contact me, I can be reached at manfromlang@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromlang. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.